Welcome to the final day of the GGD discussions. Um, I'm going to do a very brief introduction and that let Ranjit and his distinguished fellow panelists take over. But I thought I'll begin with a few sentences I'm sure you'll recognize right away, unmistakably with their profound sense of decorum and elegance. He didn't think he'd be kissing my ass. He thought it'd be just another president, American president that was a loser. But now he has to be nice to me. That's, of course, Donald Trump. In recent days about MBS of Saudi Arabia. I have to say I read this and felt a strong urge of both anger and humiliation. I think partly because, or maybe largely because, the struggle against racist imperialism that so many Arab nations engaged in was a struggle for dignity as much as it was a struggle for economic and political sovereignty. Today, and these kinds of statements prove this, that struggle seems to have gone into reverse. The great Arab nation states, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, seem subordinate in a way we've never seen. The cultures of the great Arab metropolises, Cairo, Damascus, Beirut, that we in India admired from afar, the songs, the novels, the poems, the magazines, they've all faded, or certainly not in sight anymore. These old great metropolitan centers have been replaced by some pretenders, the Gulf monarchies in particular, who have advanced their own claim to culture through grand events, construction of great museums modeled on those in Europe. Of course, they've now been thrown into doubt, a lot of this cultural endeavor, by this enormously globally destabilizing war on Iran. So the panelists today, Nasreen Malik and Omar El-Akkad, will assess the strength or fragility of these claims to culture and the possibilities of alternatives to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that if someone in, say, 12th century Europe said they were going to the Emirates, they were very likely coming here to Spain, to the universities of Nazrid, Spain, for instance. It's an interesting thought, and I flagged that to think about the various horizons in terms of which the Arab world has manifested itself to those of us who don't belong to it, but have very, very strong connections with the Arab world. Also, Pankaj, your evocation of the great Arab metropolitan centers from, say, the 50s to the 80s, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, Beirut, they remind us of these earlier cosmopolitan centers that they were, and the role that the Arab world played in relaying, interpreting, and refining and essentially reinventing all kinds of traditions of science, of storytelling, of poetry, and so on. And it acted as a bridge between, if you will, between very loosely the East and the West. And it's tragic that today somehow the Arab world is cast as the other. And Nasreen and I were just talking about this a little earlier, and it's interesting to contrast the views of the Arab world from the outside and to think about the vibrant intellectual traditions within the Arab world, the image of the Arab world that comes from within it, and why does that not always translate? And how do we address all of this, particularly in this moment of crisis verging on catastrophe? And how might the Arab world now As I use that term, the Arab world, I'm aware of how it opens out in different directions. It's always been an incredibly confluential world. In the early years of this century, which now seems an impossibly long time ago, when Ilya Tryanov and I wrote a book called Kampfabsage in German, Confluences in English, we devoted ourselves, a large part of that book, to thinking about the cusps and the intersections between the Arab world and the worlds of Persia, India, Turkey, Europe, North Africa, and all the way down to the Sahara. It strikes me that there's a way of thinking about the Arab world in any one of these horizons as a cradle and a crucible. And as we come closer in time, we think about the kinds of sectarian, if you will, conflicts that have erupted within it, the pressures from the outside which tend to polarize the discussion, and then the very, very optimistic, too optimistic moment of the Arab Spring, where it seemed like there would be a paradigm for a participatory politics that would emerge somehow magically, and which many of us, I think, cleave to in some ways, only to have that hope be dashed in certain ways and have prior structures of authority and authoritarianism reassert themselves. So I want to turn with these thoughts to Omar and to Nasreen. Omar, could I invite you first to reflect on your own position in some ways as a participant and as an observer in this world, and perhaps maybe particularly to address the moment of the Arab Spring? I think it's worthwhile revisiting that horizon of possibility.
Thank you very much for doing this. Thank you all for coming out to this. It's a privilege to be here alongside so many writers and thinkers whose work has meant so much to me over the years. A few weeks ago, I was asked to go speak to a group of school children, and I went over there and, not to pat myself on the back, but I gave what I thought was a pretty eloquent and, dare I say, profound talk to these kids. And at the end, I said, "Do you have any questions?" And one kid raised his hand and asked what ended up being the only question that morning, which was, "When is this going to be over?" I only bring this up to say that I've been coming to the realization that my impression of how good a public speaker I am and the audience's impression there seems to be a jarring disconnect there. So I'm going to try and keep this short. There's two things that come to mind. First off, that I think I need to address. One is something that almost every panelist has addressed so far, which is that we are here in Barcelona and not in Doha. And I think it's particularly ironic that we're having this discussion about Arab culture and what happened to Arab culture and the ways in which Arab culture can function in a global age when we cannot go do this in the Arab world, because the country I live in, among the 9 nations that it has bombed so far, at least during this administration, is bombing the hell out of the part of the world I grew up in. And within this strange soup of faraway human beings in which you can conflate Arab and Muslim and Iranian and any brown people anywhere, the aggregate value of those lives is nothing. And I think we should at the very least address that, because it relates to these questions of what has happened to Arab culture or what ways Arab culture needs to move. And then secondly, I find it astounding that I'm the guy up here when Ahdaf is here. Because I'm jet lagged to all hell, I was up at 2 a.m. trying to figure out what it is I bring to the table when talking about Arab culture that Ahdaf wouldn't. And I actually thought of a number of things, none of them good. And one of them relates to this idea of being an observer while having my own root system, and the root system of my blood be from this part of the world. I want to make the distinction between the notion of what Arab culture has to offer in the very asymmetric context of colonialism and capitalism, what it has to offer to other populations and other cultures that have been considered similarly expendable by those systems, versus what the culture can do to change that opinion within the systems of power, because I think those are two very different things. And I'm going to do both of those from a storytelling perspective because all I know how to do is tell stories. I have an advanced degree in absolutely nothing. I'm sort of holding on for dear life up here. But I tell stories. That's what I do. And I was thinking about one of the many sort of aspects and directions I could take this question in from a storytelling perspective, which is the notion of how you tell a story that is both dangerous and honest and tell it within a system that wants nothing to do with this. And I think Arabs are particularly good at this because we've had no choice but to be good at this. There's this story that I suspect every Arab writer knows about Naguib Mahfouz in this novel called Wilad Haratna, right? Children of Our Alley. I don't know what it was translated to in English, but this notion that this novel comes out and it's about a neighborhood in Egypt and these alley kids, and there's people who show up on behalf of the sort of mayor, and they're giving instructions, and sure, yeah, great piece of like Egyptian life, and much later does anybody sort of, does it come to the general consensus that this is actually an allegory for the Abrahamic religions. And suddenly the most famous novelist in the Arab world is stabbed in the neck and nearly killed, right? You have to learn how to hide the thing. And this is a tradition that continues to this day. When Basma Abdelaziz writes The Q, everybody knows what the government ministry, what this government is, what this unnamed place is. When she writes Here's Where the Bodies Are, whatever that was translated to into English, everybody knows what that massacre is, right? But you are induced to figure out ways to say the thing, even though, you know, the cops are still going around and taking that book off the shelves, and I don't know if she can even live in that country anymore or whatever. But this is something that I think Arabs have had to figure out of necessity. But it's something that virtually every group of human beings who have been put under the similar circumstances have had to figure out of necessity. In the United States where I live, up until the second half of the previous century, there was a really powerful thread of writing within the genre of the sort of the gumshoe, the detect, like the whodunit kind of, you know, the Big Sleep type world, where black writers would sort of enter into this through the facade of that kind of book, and you'd be reading this book, you know, who did it, who's the murderer, and at the end you'd realize, oh, the country is the murderer. It was a mode of political indictment that came in camouflaged under this very sort of superficially accessible mode of writing. And so this is what I mean by talking about modes of culture within the Arab world that are points of commonality to anybody who has been considered expendable by these systems that are fundamentally insatiable, that fundamentally have no ceiling. There is no such thing as taking enough land or taking enough resources or taking enough lives. That I'm interested in. What I'm not interested in is this notion of finding some mode of transformation for Arab or any other culture that renders it sufficiently human in the eyes of a system that has no interest in thinking of it as human, right? It doesn't exist, right? In the same way that no indigenous person in the hemisphere I now live in could have come up with some mode of transformation for their culture to make them accessible to the people whose only form of acceptability for them was their non-existence. And I think about this a lot because institutionally, I think the Arab world needs to change from the ground up. There's not a single Arab institution. I feel that way about a lot of the West. Culturally, I don't think there's a mode of transformation that will address what is fundamentally the byproduct of a system of endless taking. And I want to sort of set that as at least my personal ground rules for how to engage with this.
Thank you very much for putting those very compelling thoughts in play. It opens up in multiple directions. There's at least one that I'd like to pursue right away, and then I take those thoughts to Nisreen. I completely understand when you say that there should be no pressure on the Arab world to have to explain itself, or for Arabs or any other expendable people to explain themselves to extractive systems that would annihilate them. But that would maybe foreclose the possibility of a different kind of horizontal translation to other people elsewhere who are in that same position of abjection or who are endangered. I think quite often our dialogue tends to still be as if we were in the 19th century with a monolithic West, which is the source of power and exploitation. I don't know if you want to open that up a little. I tend to be preoccupied with questions of translation in this way, exploring also paths such as Pankaj and I have flagged this often enough. The third way, the non-aligned movement, ways of being in the world that didn't rely or that were not dependent on the superpowers. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that form of dialogue between the Arab world and other societies, other cultures in the same kind of moment of transition.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to think about. It's a fascinating question, and it's something that I am sort of naturally gravitating to because of the kind of life I've had. My dad had to get the hell out of Egypt when I was 5, and as a result, since the age of 5, I've been a guest on someone else's land. And so I think there are natural sort of ideological containers or load-bearing beams that would make my life a lot easier if I was willing to sort of adhere to them. And those have to do with the sanctity of the nation state as a concept, and I don't adhere to them. Maybe if I had remained in Egypt, I would. I don't know, but that's a shadow life that I'm never going to live. I think with respect to this idea of horizontal movement, which I think is vital, there's sort of two threats that come to mind. And again, I'm thinking of this narratively. I'm thinking of this in terms of storytelling. And the two central threats that sort of come to mind are the imposition of perception onto reality and the policing of anger, both of which are quite relevant in this moment. When I talk about this notion of the imposition of perception, I'm thinking of what I am told about myself as a function of my identity as an Arab. And when I talked earlier, I was talking about this idea of, what do I bring to the table that doesn't? You're hearing it right now, right? You're hearing someone who has spent the entirety of his adult life making himself acceptable to the systems of power that have since rewarded him for it, right? I'm not here because I'm Arab. I'm here because I had some books do well. Those books were written in English. I'm really good in English. If I switched to Arabic right now, everyone here would know I'm Egyptian because of my accent. They would also know that I left at 5 because my vocabulary would be extremely limited. There's an act of psychological self-mutilation that I have subjected myself to that has been infinitely rewarding, and that's the most insidious part of it. It has been infinitely rewarding. It's the reason my books get published. It's the reason I won those awards. And a huge part of that is because I accepted that the imposition of this perception of what it means to be an Arab, of what it means to be Muslim, of what it means to be a guy whose real name is Omar Muhammad La'ed but is introduced as Omar Lakad because the ayin is unpronounceable in English. And I have accepted that that perception is more important than the reality of the situation, which fundamentally I think is one of the central hurdles to any kind of horizontal movement among equals under the shadow of a system of power that doesn't consider you equal. There's a story I wrote about I had a book come out, a nonfiction book come out last year, and I wrote this story about what happened with my first novel, this book called American War, which I think of as a very Arab book. I think of it as a superimposition of the conflicts that have shaped the part of the world I grew up in, superimposed onto the heart of the empire. No one in the United States has read it that way because it's called American War. It has American right there in the title. It's an American book, right? But the middle of that book takes place in a camp for internally displaced Americans called Camp Patience. And almost everything that happens in that section of the book is based on a massacre that took place in Sabra and Shatia, right? Presumably with this audience, I don't have to explain to you what Sabra and Shatia is. I do in the US. And one of the questions I would get when I would do events in the US over and over and over again is, did you really have to make that section so brutal? And I would explain, look, the tether, the thing that is tethered to is brutal. The dialogue, the characters that you're reading is from witness testimony of what happened. And I would do that over and over again. And then I did a virtual event with an Egyptian book club. And for them, it wasn't far away. right? And the first question I got was, well, if this is based on Sabra and Shatia, why did you tone it down so much? Right? They were reading an entirely different book. And it was the book they were reading was the one I intended to write, and the one that has been read far less often. The superimposition of the perception is so much more powerful because it comes from the power center. So that's one part. The other part is the management of anger. The other thing that comes up whenever I do these events is, oh, you've written this book, like you remain so calm. I was like, yeah, I'm an Arab Muslim guy living in the US. Like, what the hell do you want me to do? There's a certain level of expression of anger after which the ceiling on the imagination of what I am capable of doing becomes unlimited. Because over and over again, in virtually every element of popular culture, especially the most popular culture, I'm thinking of film, I'm thinking of TV, I'm thinking of the things that are consumed by more human beings than anything I will ever write, I, by virtue of my Arab identity, can be one of only three kinds of people. I can be the bad guy who's the terrorist, I can be the good guy who helps Jack Bauer catch the terrorist, or I can be the fruit and vegetable vendor whose stall is destroyed in a Matt Damon car chase. That is the entirety of the spectrum of my experience, right? I would submit that given that I come from a part of the world that during my adult lifetime, the entirety of my adult lifetime, has been subjected to a series of illegal invasions that have left upwards of 1 million human beings dead, that in fact, within the confines of Arab culture, the management of anger is some of the most disciplined and restrained I have seen anywhere. And every time I turn on the TV or listen to the popular discourse in the part of the world I now live in, the exact opposite perception is presented because it's the only thing that justifies the continuation of this asymmetry and the violence entailed within. And I think until we come up with, and when I say we, I'm talking about a weird middle space of folks who maybe have one foot in each of these worlds, until we come up with a way of shedding with full knowledge that there will be an amount of success and amount of privilege that goes along with that, the expectation that we should have our anger managed and that we should cater to the perception when the perception is at direct odds with reality, we are wasting our time. And those, I think, are the two central hurdles to what you described, which I think is very necessary movement along horizontal lines to other people who at other moments in history and at this present moment are undergoing their version of the exact same phenomena.
Thank you for that, Omar. That was an account that had both honesty and candor and risk implicit in what you articulated. Nasreen, I want to turn to you with the same stream of thoughts, but also to think through with you questions of how the abundance and the richness of Arab culture is unavailable to your other audience, if you will. You serve as a bridge figure, as someone who is, I wouldn't say representing each side to the other, but there's a dimension of your work which involves that kind of translation. Would you address this question? Also in terms of how to you very much, and to some of us through osmosis, we remember these cities for the graphics biennales they had, the literature festivals, the journals, all of this. But I've begun to be afraid that so much of this is in nostalgic mode. How does one relay that into the future in a more active way?
There's a lot there. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and particularly happy to be here with Omar, a writer I admire and that I have drawn a lot of succor and comfort from over the years. So thank you, Omar, for your work. So I'll answer your question first about translation and the mode between Arab and non-Arab. And then I'll get into the notes that I've made for today. So it's interesting. I do not feel like even though I write in English and I write for a British newspaper, I feel like I write in Arabic and English, if that makes sense. And I can, in the beginning, I'd be curious to see if Ahmad has had something similar, but in the beginning, I remember when I started writing, I wanted to sound a certain way. authoritative, by definition, white, male, almost, if that can be a voice that can be inhabited, and credible and distant and aloof. There's a whole architecture to that voice. And I realized that I couldn't pull it off, and B, that there is a real distance between that mode and the mode of feeling and thought. So there was no ability to translate what I've thought and what I've felt in that voice. And then I just began to write in English, in Arabic, or in Arabic in English, in that I draw on, in ways that are infinitely bewildering to me, I draw on sentence construction in Arabic, on emotional modes of speech, of style, of metaphor, of anger, of all the ways in which the Arabic that I grew up speaking, and the Pan-Arabic that I grew up speaking as well, not just the vernacular. I think that's very important. Was a language of all of these pent-up political managements of feeling, and they erupted in the personal and in the street and in our media voices and discourses. And so I think that sometimes the answer to how can you translate or how can you move from one culture to another and cross-pollinate is just to allow oneself to translate within themselves first, if that makes sense. To do an instantaneous and spontaneous translation of how one is feeling and how one is thinking. But I'm more interested, in this conversation in particular, but broadly more interested in modeling power. How do you model power? How do you model empowerment? How do you translate the public into the political? And I want to start here with two moments. I feel like there was a conversation yesterday about how Jesuits speak in threes. And I feel like for the past couple of days, we've spoken in two moments, two contrasting moments. Hadaf did it yesterday, and I have just two snapshots that I want to link to this concept of nostalgia and the Arab Spring and all that was ostensibly wasted. So I grew up in Khartoum of I'm going to give myself away here, the 1980s and early 90s. And Khartoum was the backwater of the Arab world at the time. Like a thriving city, but it wasn't a metropolis. It wasn't Cairo, it wasn't Beirut, it wasn't Damascus. But it was a city that read a lot, consumed a lot of literature and newspapers. And I will never forget, I'm glad Safwan isn't here because he'll bite my head off for this moment of nostalgia. There was a kiosk, a newspaper kiosk that my father would stop at on the way back from school. And it had a cornucopia of Arabic newspapers. There was the Sharq al-Awsat, there was Sawt al-Arab, and the Sharq al-Awsat was green, which made it stand out. It was this kind of lurid green newspaper. But it was the best one. That's why it was green. It was like our New York Times, right? But then there was the pink newspapers as well. There was the sepia ones. So there was all the Pan-Arab newspapers, and I couldn't for the life of me find out how, when air travel at the time and supply chains and stuff were so slow, how we got a daily newspaper in Khartoum, of all places, from distribution centers in Cairo and in the Levant. So there was all the Arabic newspapers. Then there was the comic books, right? There was, for those who know, there was Majid that was produced in Kuwait. It was like a Kuwaiti comic book about a young kid called Majid who wore the ghutra and then there was the other kind of indigenous Pan-Arab comic books for kids, and then there was the translations of Disney, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. There was it was this entire universe of Arabic literature, comic books, and and translations, and it was entirely self-contained and hermetic. I did not grow up with any sense of the West as a place that A, I knew anything about, B, wanted to visit, or knew anyone that lived there. I remember an aunt of mine married a rich man and was taken to Disneyland. And she came back and we were like, it was like she'd gone to Mars, you know? It was just this entirely distant place that was only translated to us in what we needed to know. The orientation was entirely towards Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, Tripoli, Sana'a, because lots of my family and wider extended networks lived and worked in these cities. Lots of teachers. Sudanese were they populated the kind of high schools of the Arab world in the 1970s and 80s. So that's one snapshot. And then there is a contemporary snapshot, and I've been working on a piece about pop culture post-Gaza in the Arab world. So popular culture, particularly in terms of music and writing. And I spoke to a lot of young people for this piece in Egypt and in Qatar and in other parts of the Arab world, and most of these people received all their culture from their phones. It was entirely via short clips and reels. So it wasn't even sitting and listening to like a half-hour podcast. It was Instagram reels, TikTok reels, and forwards. A lot of it was forwards on WhatsApp. However, even though on the face of it, this looks like an incredible degeneration in terms of the lingua franca that a region can forge, even via these, to me, as a fustial person, inferior modes of communication, they nonetheless had seeded exactly the same sense of familiarity, complicity, knowledge, intimacy, warmth for other Arabs that I had in the 1980s and 1990s, which I thought was fascinating, even though I worry about this generation a lot, where I'm like, what is it like growing up with the Arab Spring as a matter of history, you know, as a moment that for people of my generation still is, it's populated in our hinterland, but feels like it could come again. What does it feel like to grow up with that moment be something in the rearview mirror? And I found that there was still a language and a fabric that bound these people together in anger, in frustration, in humiliation, in the understanding, even if just instinctive, in the understanding that our governments and our politicians are really letting us down in a way that I think is being rediscovered constantly across parts of the Arab world. So those are the two moments. And then I'll link now to the Arab Spring, which you referred to as the failures of the Arab Spring, or that we were too optimistic about that model. I don't agree with that at all. I think the Arab Spring, just to go back to the point about what Arab culture can translate into, what it can teach, I think the Arab Spring was a profoundly instructive lesson in the embeddedness of economic, military, and political power structures that are not unique to the Arab world. And I think the lack of fruition of the Arab Spring is the same dynamic that occurs when you do not get good electoral outcomes in Western countries. The fact that you cast your ballot for someone in Europe or in the US is now increasingly characterized by not getting the results aligned with your wish, right? You can vote for a left-wing, ostensibly left-wing party in the UK and still get a genocide-supporting, free speech suppressing, non-redistributive party. So this mode of constantly getting less than you hoped for, less than you promised, because you're constantly discovering and rediscovering the depth of the roots of economic arrangements, status quos that linked to political and military establishments, is something that I think we've just learned earlier than others, and others are still trying to figure that out. And then just to end and pull all these things together and bring it back to the modeling of power, what I feel is the biggest potential and excitement and frustration about the Arab world, which is in itself a concept that maybe we should interrogate a little bit, but not too much, because I do think there is an Arab world, is that you have a thread amongst Arabs, the one that I talked about in the 70s and 80s with the newspapers and the comic books and the pop stars and the chants and the Abdul Halims and the Fayruzes and the Kulthums and all the ways in which we all knew each other in frankly, shockingly intimate ways, considering we'd never met. How those still exist in other modes. Because fundamentally, the geographical, cultural, sociological facts on the ground are legion. This is a region, this is the largest single language speaking bloc in the world. It is the largest geographical bloc in which you can travel from the furthest west to the furthest east. I was saying this to Ahdaf yesterday, land in a city and broadly crack on. It is a place where whatever generation you were born in, you can pick up your green newspaper or your phone and look on TikTok and understand instinctively that there is something that joins you with these other millions and billions of people. And Gaza is a kind of galvanizing aspect of that, but it goes beyond and pre-exists the Palestinian cause. And so what I'm interested in is, how do you translate that huge potential of power, of public affinity, of solidarity? How do you translate that in two ways? How do you translate it into political power? How do you overcome the non-aligned outcomes of revolution and election? How do you start working on breaking apart, for want of a better phrase, the deep states, and how they lock on and work with deep states elsewhere? We'll get onto this, I hope, but how one of the biggest things that has brought the Arab world to its knees is this kind of tucking in behind American hegemony. So how do you translate that domestically? Then how do you model that to the rest of the world, right? How do you model that participatory, galvanizing politics to countries that don't have the privileges that Arabs do, the knowledges and the affinities and the intimacies? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasreen. When I think about the Arab Spring, it's not in any way to condemn it as a failure. It's more an elegiac response, to see it as a reserve of possibility that may have been defeated in that moment, but which remains. But as you were speaking, I thought that the way in which you evoke the Arab world also brings to mind other kinds of forms of collective being. Thinking here of the idea of the Ummah, the Islamic ecumeny, if you will. I use the word with caution, but to suggest this large transcontinental ecumeny across which there are so many affinities that can then that can become grounds for solidarity in some ways. But I was also thinking of how, when we think back to those moments of the 60s and the great flourishing cultures of the Arab world, we're also thinking of how, in many ways, that emerged from an intellectual project, the notion of pan-Arabism. Many of these capitals were Ba'athist capitals in that sense. And it's tragic to see how that political and intellectual project has somehow been compromised by certain monstrous forms of the political, whilst there's still this popular, democratic, demotic vibrancy. So thank you for evoking all of that. But I don't know if you want to push further, both of you, and talk more about what you characterized as the complicity of the deep states in the Arab world with American hegemony, and what might be the forms of participatory politics what might be the sources of a participatory politics today? Omar, I don't know, could I turn to you first and then come back to Nasreen?
Yeah, thank you for that. It was really interesting listening to you speak because there were so many points where I was like, no, but nobody has brought that up in exactly the way I've thought it. And then you did. Thank you for that. That was very comforting. And I live in a very crazy making place, and so to get grounded like that is kind of nice every once in a while. I had a somewhat different relationship with over there, I think. I wanted for it desperately. And it took me a long time to realize that the thing I wanted was not the active space, it was the negative space. I often tell this story about the first movie that was ever shown in the cinemas of Qatar. So I grew up in Qatar, I grew up in Doha in the sort of 80s, 90s. And in the late 90s, we got our first sort of functioning cinema. And they played Titanic. Titanic came out that year. And when I say they played Titanic, I mean that they played only Titanic, day in and day out, for the better part of a year. And so we went to watch Titanic day in and day out for the better part of the year because there was nothing else to do. You were going to go to the Pizza Hut or you were going to go watch this movie. Years later, I go to Canada, and I'm on my dorm floor, and my girlfriend and I are going to go to dinner, and some other kids on the floor were watching Titanic, and I got all nostalgic, and I told my girlfriend, hey, let's watch it real quick, and then we'll go out to dinner. And she was like, what are you talking about? It's a 3-hour movie. We're not going to watch it real quick. And I was like, no, it's not. It's like 60 minutes. It took me a very long time to realize that I had just been watching a very censored version of this movie. I just thought it was very poorly edited. But when you live in that kind of environment, what you want is not the 3-hour version of Titanic. What you want is not the censored version of Titanic. And I hope I can make that distinction clearly, because broadly speaking, in almost everywhere in the world, the right to agree with power is the same. The right to nod and smile and agree with your political or corporate overseers is the same. It's the same in the US as it is in Egypt. It might have superficial differences in the sense that I drive around Egypt in the 90s and I see billboards congratulating Hosni Mubarak on winning an election that hasn't happened yet. But broadly speaking, everywhere in the world you have the right to agree with power. What is different is what happens when you decide to go in the opposite route, right? And that's what I wanted for. I wanted desperately to be left alone, to think whatever the hell I wanted to think, to say whatever I wanted to say, and there's vast differences along that spectrum. And I think of this in the context of when I went to cover the Arab Spring, it was one of only 2 times in my life that I've been tear gassed. I was a journalist for 10 years before I started making stuff up for a living, and during that time I got tear gassed twice. I got tear gassed in Tahrir when I was covering the Arab Spring. The next time I got tear gassed was in Ferguson, Missouri, when I was covering the Black Lives Matter movement. After that cop killed that guy and Ferguson blew up, basically. It was also the second time that I'd seen something resembling a light armored vehicle. The first time I saw it was in Afghanistan. The second time I saw it was in Ferguson, Missouri. There is nothing that has been done to Arabs, either by their own governments or by or with the assistance of foreign governments, that can be done to anyone on this planet. And I think one of the central reasons that for the first time since the Arab Spring, I am feeling something resembling hope is because I think I'm seeing distances close with respect to the privilege of obliviousness to this fact. You know, there are lots and lots of people where I live now who, for the first time, are realizing what it means to live in a place like Gaza, what it means to live in an open-air prison, and to have a soldier decide one day that cardamom is a security threat and can't be brought in. What it means to have your every movement monitored. And some of those people are finding that along a purely moral axis. This is wrong. And a lot of people are finding that out through the axis of self-interest. that drone that just killed that Palestinian kid is coming to my police department. It is on its way, just like that light armored vehicle that you saw in Kandahar is now in Ferguson. And I think that acknowledgement for me is the prerequisite for whatever we talk about in terms of anything resembling a political approach. Yesterday, I think it was Mohsen paraphrased something that I think William Gibson first said, which is the idea that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think we have been conditioned, and I keep saying we, I mean someone who has my existence, who has a foot in both of these worlds, have been conditioned to think of the place I now live as the future, you know? And it is, along the axis of convenience, for example. My Amazon packages arrive faster than you could imagine. And they continue to, every day they arrive a little bit faster. But there are other forms of future, right? Almost every panel that we've had here, regardless of subject matter, has in some way veered back to something like the climate crisis, right? Because it's this planet we live on. That is a future that quite possibly is headed in the exact opposite direction of convenience, in fact, headed towards the end point of catastrophe. And I would submit to you that virtually every human being who lives in the poorest, most vulnerable parts of the planet could learn to live my lifestyle in about 20 minutes. The opposite is not true. And I would further submit to you that the ability to survive under those conditions, under the conditions where my shoes were made, are such that every human being where I live, who lives under that privilege and tells me every day that these systems of endless extraction are the only way of doing things, if they were subjected to one day of that, would immediately be the greatest advocate for burning this entire system down. And that's going to happen. I am doubtful about almost everything. I am not doubtful about this. Because fundamentally, you have, in every Arab capital I've been in, and in much of the world now, you have a situation where life is getting better and better for an increasingly tinier sliver. In Egypt, they keep finding new spots in the desert to build these beautiful compounds. And then the compounds get too close to the rabble, right? And they go out a little further and they build their nice little compounds. How long are we going to keep doing this for? Life gets infinitely worse for an even greater segment of the population. And I think recognizing that disconnect is not only a prerequisite, it's the only way we're going to save this from happening in a much, much more violent way that I suspect makes the Arab Spring look pale by comparison. Sorry, I ate up all our time.
Quick words before we turn.
Can I just say something real quick? I'll just say something real quick before we go into the Q&A, which is I would urge more reflection or at least acknowledgement of how much there is a laudanum of consumerism that has become a very big part of the interruption of political processes in the Middle East and the Arab world. These are, in different ways, these are countries that have either had economic crisis, civil wars, poverty before discovering natural resources, and they've all sort of come online together post-Arab Spring, if you take away Libya and Syria and now Sudan. But there is a sort of economic, there's a hectic economic process of consumerism and fetishization and glorification of global tastes and an effacing of local tastes, indigenous or even traditional tastes. There's like a weird race to the future in the way that you described it, which is this place that was like clean and modern and convenient. And I find that in a way, even though it seems quite banal, I find that the most threatening thing, or the thing that is most terrifying. This kind of convergence of tastes and the compounds and the modern lines and the steel and the glass and the marble, and the expanding of the middle classes, not necessarily in terms of their income, but in terms of their tastes. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Isreen. Yeah. Could we have questions? God, shell-shocked or spellbound.
Can you tell us a little bit about this inner translation? All right. Now the expectation is
She said, can you tell us something about this inner translation?
because that is the process that we don't really talk about.
That is the process that we don't really talk about, she said. Amar, do you want to?
No.
I'm just trying to frame this usefully. I do think, just to respond to something Amar said earlier, I do think it is good that you are where you are. I think it's good that it's good for us. When I say us, I mean Arabs and Arab adjacents and those who need to know more. I think it is good for us that you had to go through that process of psychological mutilation, because what has been produced is, or the outcome of that is someone who has had to contend with all the ways in which these different languages and heritages exist within them and compete and produce certain political outcomes, right? Certain political ideologies, certain orientations where you turn away or turn towards. These processes, I think, are painful to go through individually, but they are the manifestation of a lot of human movement, I think, across the world. We carry inside us so much. Even those who did grow up and are embedded quite comfortably in their contexts, there is a kind of broader exiling that happens. Because you have to thrive, you have to learn English, and to prosper, you have to work in English, and to attain a certain kind of lifestyle, you have to be Western adjacent. So I think we're all going through these processes of psychological mutilation and internal exile and physical exile. And that increasingly is the terrain we have to navigate to try and understand what we really believe, right? And what we really care for and what our role is. And to have someone model that is, I think, very important, because I don't think many people realize that there is that line of thought going through their heads. I was in Cartagena with Pankaj a few weeks ago, and I went for a walk. I'll get to the point about translation shortly. I went for a walk, and it started raining, and the drains overflew, and the kind of smell of the drains mixed with the smell of the rain, and I felt like I could cry with happiness because it just was such a familiar smell. You know, it was just a kind of, it smelled like Khartoum, it smelled like Cairo, it smelled like all these different places that I'd grown up in, and it felt real, and it felt unintermediated by sanitization or like very clean roads or gravel or the big machines scrubbing the roads in the morning after the rain. There was a certain kind of architecture of smell that made me feel, genuinely stopped me in my tracks. And then I began thinking, you know, we carry around with us all these shards of memory, of smell, of sight, of sound, of all the places that were home but are no longer home and will never be home again. And that is an incredibly painful experience. And billions of people are going through it across the world. Not necessarily even the ones who were, you know, very clearly made refugees or who were very clearly made exiles. Everyone is dislocated from their village to the town, from the town to the city, from one country to the next. The global lingua franca way of doing economics, what we're told we should aspire to, all these ways are profoundly deracinating, dehoming, deeply unsettling. And so to name these processes of psychological mutilation, what you have to bend yourself into, what you have to constantly have jangling around inside you, and quietening that and silencing it so you can have like a good corporate job or get a mortgage or whatever. These are profoundly painful, and I think experiences that we were not designed to have as human beings. I think the opposite is how we're designed. So on the translation bit, I got there in the end. It feels like the more we speak in those voices, the more the truth will become sharpened. So in my experience, I'll give you a very small example. So my mom has a way of saying, it's not just her expression, it's a kind of broader Sudanese expression, but when she wants to say, you did something without consulting someone, and it concerned them, she'd say, you did it on top of their heads, she'd say. She'd say like, ala ras, you did this on top of the head, which doesn't make sense in English. But I made it make sense, right? So now, like it came to my head when I came to write about forging an Arab world without consulting the Palestinians. That happened on top of their heads, right? The new Arab world. And my editor didn't even flinch. He was just like, yeah, I get it. That you did it on top. You did it on top of the Palestinians' heads. And to say it that way, as opposed to say, without the consultation or advice of the Palestinian people, without involving them in the political process, like already there is a bloodlessness and a lack of truthfulness to the bluntness and disrespect of the action. So in my having like spoken about the kind of broader mutilation and how important it is to understand that we need to bring out these voices and these experiences of mutation. On a personal level, I'm trying to bring out these little shards and hope that they together in a kind of sharp, jagged jigsaw try and create a voice that is an amalgamation of all these different experiences and voices. I'll stop there.
Omar, I was just thinking.
Yeah, I couldn't have said any better than that.
As you were speaking, I thought shards are what give us kaleidoscopes. And also to the point about on top of their heads, I thought one could say that they went over their heads, but that already, it's not the same, because going over someone's head is to break hierarchy. Yeah. But this is something else altogether. It's a beautiful phrase. Yeah. Let's take one last question. Could we?
I wanted to ask a question, since the conversation at Finestras also, about internationalism, the histories of internationalism, the long resistance movements that bound the world in another way, and how so much of that by globalization has been in imperialism and colonialism and the IMF and the World Bank, and all of the deep effects of all of this has gutted the histories and the immediate access to those histories and those strategies of organizing and resistance. And I wonder, in your experiences, in your access to collective memory, how do these play out and serve as repositories of memory for activism? How are they getting reactivated, and what is missing and what has been lost?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mentioned earlier that by virtue of the kind of life I've had, I don't have much respect for the concept of the nation state as this sort of fundamentally sacrosanct, thing. And it's in the nature of all I write. Almost all of my writing in one form or another has that at its core. There's a very strange story about when I was writing American War. I was writing it in a house in Portland, and I had this little room to myself. At the time, I was still working as a journalist, and so I would do these video hits for my newspaper's website, and at the same time, I was writing the novel in that room. And so in the back of the room, I had this giant wall map of the U.S. Where I was drawing out my various conflict points of the Second American Civil War that is sort of central to the... So long story short, there were all these videos of me on the Globe and Mail website, in which behind me there's a map that just says suicide bombing here, or like whatever, and it was a very bad look. On on that map, I had given sort of most of the Southwest back to Mexico, and Florida was underwater and all that. I think for most of our history, that has been the case, right? That this relatively new form of bounding people is, not that much older than I am. Certainly a lot of the conventions that make it feel sacred, and which, like a lot of conventions in the modern world, date back to essentially trying to stop a bunch of Europeans from killing each other, is all fairly recent. And the way I tend to think about the question as you've posed it is in terms of imagination, right? It's not that there aren't alternatives to this. In fact, it's not even that there aren't alternatives to this that could mitigate the damage within this system, right? And I think this is where a lot of particularly left-leaning movements tend to fall apart, is maybe you and I are sitting here talking about imagining a better world. Well, the ceiling on that imagination is unlimited, right? Maybe you want to burn everything down and start from scratch. Maybe I just want to tax billionaires a little bit more, right? That is a mitigation aspect that could go within. It's not going to fix things. It's only going to delay the inevitable. But there are all manner of ways of thinking about our solidarity across these very, very artificial, contrived ways of corseting the world. At least in my experience in the United States, what effectively takes all of this off the table is this consistent limiting of the imagination. The labor movement in the United States has been decimated to the point where we can have our little No Kings March and people can take out their actual labor stoppage and actual strike is a much more difficult. Then it's like, well, hold on a second. I got upset yesterday because a bunch of protesters blocked the highway exit and I couldn't get to work. You want me to stop? And all of that is the limiting of imagination, layer upon layer upon layer. And I think by necessity, you're starting to see that ripped apart a little bit. We were talking yesterday about this idea of socialism in the United States and what the hell that even means, right? Almost every definition in the United States is warped to some degree. And in this case, it's warped by young people being told over and over again every time they ask for the most basic improvement to their condition, then no, this is socialism. I want to not have to choose between a financial and a physical death sentence if I get sick. That's socialism. Hey, we keep killing each other with guns. Maybe we should do something about guns. Socialism. Man, I really like socialism, right? Like you've been telling me over and over again. And so the very sort of bleak way that I come to an area of hope with respect to this notion of finding something other than the bordered world is through this constant depletion of the imagination eventually hitting a wall. Whenever, I wrote this book that has gotten a lot of traction because of the moment we're in. I don't think it has much to do with the quality of the book. It has a lot more to do with people feeling like they're losing their minds. And overwhelmingly, when I go talk to younger folks, they don't find anything remotely profound or revolutionary in this book. They're so far ahead of me because they have to live under these projections and these trajectories longer than I do, right? Like I come from a long line of malfunctioning hearts. Probably I don't live long enough to see the worst of the climate disaster. They will. My children and grandchildren will. And so this to me is the route towards something better, which inevitably I think has to directly contradict the violence of the bordered world. When I think of this notion of the nation state now, I am thinking of the violence of borders overwhelmingly, particularly in the part of the world I live in. Sorry, the time to wrap up sign has been held for the last 20 minutes and I'm just going on.
Thank you. Let's take those thoughts about the violence of the bordered world with us to coffee. Thank you very much indeed, Nasreen, Omar, and all of you.